Hi, I'm David Schmidt, and thank you for joining me for this presentation, Jehovah's Leninists, Cultic Dynamics Among Political Radicals. When a mob of political fanatics attacked the US Capitol in January of this year, many people around the world first learned of a very recent cultic group that has been growing over the past few years, the QAnon movement. They had a lot of their followers among those rioters at the US Capitol. And QAnon has a very elaborate mythology that they've developed, which uses a lot of religious and spiritual language. They have an alternate version of history and politics in which progressive politicians, figures like George Soros, are members of a satanic secret society that is kidnapping and abusing and sacrificing children and drinking their bodily fluids, resurrecting a lot of the old blood libel stories from medieval Europe. And QAnon's language, it's very mythological, very apocalyptic, borrowing a lot of pseudo-Judeo-Christian language. They talk about the coming storm, which is a sort of an apocalypse in which Donald Trump will usher in this age of glory with a military coup and assassinate all of these Satanists who control the world. There are prophecies predicting the future. Donald Trump is described as God's chosen leader. And there are even QAnon Bible study groups that hold online meetings where they interpret the Bible through this mythology of QAnon. Now, when a lot of my atheist and non-religious friends learned about QAnon, they came to me and told me, you see, David, this just shows what religion leads to. That kind of extremism, that's the end result of religion. If we could just get rid of religion, of theism, of supernatural beliefs, we wouldn't have to deal with this kind of thing. Now, a lot of people think that way. But that mentality ignores the fact that there are many other fanatical groups similar to QAnon in the US, pro-Trump groups, hard-right groups, which display the same cultic tendencies, but have no supernatural beliefs at all. And author Steve Hassan has written an entire book titled The Cult of Trump. He's a former Moonie himself. He knows a thing or two about cults. And in Psychology Today, Hogan M. Sherrow, PhD, wrote an article titled, Can Trump's Followers Be Called a Cult? In which he makes an argument for applying the term to the fringe, hardcore group of followers. But beyond Donald Trump, beyond the far right in the United States, beyond whatever is happening in US politics right now, there's a long history of cultic groups which are often overlooked in cultic studies and in discussions of cults. And that's groups that have no spiritual beliefs, no God talk, no supernatural anything, but still display the same cultic behavior. And those are political cults. And that's what I'll be talking about today. Now, I'll give you a little overview of what we'll be talking about. I'm going to review briefly some of the history of cultic groups in the political sphere, especially political radicals around the world. But then I'll be going in depth into one particular group that I had a close relationship with for many years, a group that displayed many cultic tendencies, and that is the ISO, the International Socialist Organization. So I'll be going in depth into the ISO, and finally, I'll be talking about why this matters. Why does it matter to talk about non-religious political cults in particular? So a little bit about myself so you know where I'm coming from. I'm David Schmidt, an author and translator, and I come from an evangelical Christian background. Growing up, I was involved in many different evangelical groups, churches, youth groups, parachurch ministries, and many of them displayed cultic dynamics, which has really made me personally committed to understanding that sort of dynamic, that topic. Now, I still am theistic. I am a Catholic Christian myself now. So that's just revealing some of my own personal perspective on this matter. But as somebody from an evangelical background, the last place that I expected to come across the dynamic that I had seen from pastors and youth leaders was in an atheistic Marxist activist organization, the ISO, which I'll be talking about. Now, let's look back on some of the recent history. QAnon is only the latest in a long, long history of politically oriented groups that show cultic dynamics. Many far-right groups, neo-Nazis, skinheads, Ku Klux Klan, show those dynamics, creating an alternate reality, an alternate truth, where the farther someone gets into those fringe groups, the more and more all of their information about the world is filtered through the group itself. The Southern Poverty Law Center has done a great job documenting very in-depth many of those far-right groups and hate groups, and I highly recommend that all the material that they have published. They release a monthly newsletter, the Intelligence Report, which often features interviews with former members of hate groups and with law enforcement that infiltrates them. And it illustrates those cultic dynamics that come up in those groups. And of course, many of these groups are extremely authoritarian. Many of them worship authoritarian leaders from Europe of the past. So why would they not be? So those cultic dynamics are present there. And then on the other side of the political spectrum, many Marxist revolutionary groups have shown cultic behavior as well. We're all familiar with the stories about the Khmer Rouge and the Viet Cong during the 60s and 70s, about the re-education camps, sleep deprivation, food deprivation used to indoctrinate people. But a more recent and very interesting example comes from Peru in the 1980s and 90s. That's the Shining Path guerrilla army. And now it grew to huge numbers in the 1980s. President Fujimori launched many attacks against them. But if you watch any interviews with Shining Path guerrilla members, listen to the discourse, even if you don't speak Spanish. Listen to the tone. Political speeches, lines memorized rote are just recited in this staccato, monotone fashion. There's an author who spent some time interviewing Shining Path guerrillas who were in prison in Peru, and he gives a great testimony of what that was like, of sitting down with these people and listening to just hours of memorized political discourse that was recited rote with no variation at all. He describes this in very painstaking detail, the sort of glazed stare in the eyes, people shouting chants for hours and hours. The prisoners who had been in the Shining Path and were in Peru in the prisons would march for hours singing anthems and songs of the group. So the author who documents that is Patrick Sims, Symmes, in his book, Chasing Che, A Motorcycle Journey in Search of the Guevara Legend. Really recommend that book. So Shining Path, many of these groups are fringe groups, political radicals. They're on the margins of politics on the far right and on the far left. But every now and then in history, a group like that comes into power and starts applying the cultic thinking to the entire nation. Of course, we have the examples of the fascist movements in Europe in the mid-20th century, 1930s and 40s, the cult of personality around their leaders. An entire alternate reality was created about the world, very black and white thinking, us versus them, this Manichaean thinking. And then, of course, you have the example of North Korea. And in North Korea, mythological language being applied to the leaders, to the Kim family, in a nation that is ostensibly atheist, Marxist, language that can only be described as mythological, supernatural language is used to describe these leaders, attributing superhuman feats to them, and especially around their deaths. So for both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, when they died, there were stories about supernatural phenomena happening, that the top of a mountain glowed red when Kim Jong-il died. They said that when Kim Il-sung died, a flock of thousands of cranes came down from the heavens and lifted him up to heaven. And again, this isn't a nation that ostensibly is atheistic, but you have these myths cropping up. So going into detail on the group that I happen to encounter, and many other people as well have noticed these tendencies, this group is the International Socialist Organization, the ISO. It's still active in the United States and many other countries. They claim to have 10,000 members. Numbers are probably much lower than that. There's no real hard statistics on their numbers, but it's a group that's present, especially on university, college campuses across the United States. It's a Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist group, an activist group that pushes left-wing causes of all types, and their primary goal is to grow their own organization. It's an offshoot of a group in the UK called the Socialist Workers' Party, which has very similar dynamics itself. So how did I come across the ISO, the International Socialist Organization? Well, in the early 2000s, in San Diego, California, my hometown, I was very involved in the immigrants' rights movement. In 2006, there was a proposed bill in the US Senate, the Sensenbrenner bill, and outrage sparked across the nation. Thousands, millions of people took to the streets to protest that bill and to demand rights for immigrants, undocumented immigrants especially. And I was a part of that movement. And I was very involved for many years with a group called Si Se Puede. And in that group, we came in contact with the ISO. And I was very close to joining a couple times. And I thank the heavenly powers that I didn't join, because it would have been even harder if I had. As it was, the group was a thorn in our side because of how they related to our immigrants' rights group. Now, the first thing I should say about the ISO is that they are evangelistic. They are out to make new converts. If you talk to them, they will say that their main goal is to support other progressive movements. And to be sure, you'll see them present at many progressive movements, at marches, at protests, and it looks like that is true. You'll see them at anything that is a progressive cause. It might be a union organizing campaign in a city. It might be an environmental cause, LGBT rights, immigrants' rights, of course, many other causes, anti-war. But they are involved in those other movements and with those other organizations primarily to look for new members. And that's the only reason to interact with other people when you're in the ISO, is to convert them, to bring them over to the truth, to your group's way of thinking. That's the only reason to have friends, to go to parties. Most of your free time is spent proselytizing in the ISO. When you are a committed member, you are expected to spend time on your weekends, your days off, your free time, to spend time selling the group's newspaper. The Socialist Worker is the name. It's a biweekly tabloid newspaper. The style of it's very similar to the supermarket tabloids, with very provocative images and bold-faced text, very black and white presentation of current events. And as an ISO member, you're expected to spend as much time as you can selling that newspaper, raising money for the organization. So all of your interactions with other people are to bring in new members, but the most significant of those interactions is with other leftist progressive organizations. So ISO members will show up at an activist meeting of any type. It could be a women's rights group. It could be, these days, Black Lives Matter group. And at my time, our immigrants' rights organization. They will show up there, get involved, but eventually you start to notice that they are pushing things in a direction that they've decided on in advance. And if you spend more time interacting with them, you start to notice that members of your group will disappear. Bit by bit, you won't see certain members anymore. And then you'll learn that those members have gone over to the ISO instead. So they begin by selling people their newspapers, talking to people about socialism, about Marxism, about the Russian Revolution and Leninism. and they get people coming to their ISO meetings. Eventually, those people are going to both meetings, both their original activist organization and the ISO meetings. And after some time, those people often leave the original organization, or they'll go back to the original organization to push whatever activities or beliefs or interpretation of current events that the ISO has previously decided upon. So that's the way they interact with other activist groups. And the ISO, and this is from my observations and many other people who have been members or been involved with them, there's an absolutism in the way they talk about most things about politics, especially with their Marxist-Leninist Trotskyist line, and they're very serious about that. So Trotsky in the history of Russia is this watershed dividing moment. Whenever they talk about the Russian Revolution prior to Stalin, it's heaven on earth. They rarely have anything negative to say. They might admit some little mistakes were made, but there's rarely any negative comments on the Russian Revolution from Lenin up to Stalin. And then from Stalin to the end of the Soviet Union, they have nothing but bad things to say about the Soviet Union. Not recognizing what for most progressives were positive things the Soviet Union accomplished, defeating fascist Germany, supporting Cuba during its crisis, supporting the African National Congress during the apartheid government. But you won't hear them talk about these positive things because there's this very Manichaean black and white pre-Stalin Soviet Union equals good, post-Stalin equals evil, bad, and they describe it as state capitalism. So that's not the only area where that thinking is implemented. In fact, with any decision that the ISO's cadre, that their leading group has made about current events, about the current movement, politics, about the activist movement, they will have open discussions amongst themselves to decide what stance to take on. So in our case, it was what stance to take regarding immigrants' rights in San Diego and in California, how best to fight for immigrants' rights. So they'll have a discussion and then reach a conclusion about what position needs to be the position of the movement. And once they've decided on that position, it is locked away, set in stone, and there's no discussing it. So then they bring that to other organizations and push that, and will argue and will shout and fight tooth and nail to push that position. And that official position of the ISO, of the local ISO or nationwide, sometimes it'll change. Sometimes it'll flip-flop. And it reminds me a lot of the history of the Jehovah's Witnesses, where the organization will sometimes hold one position on organ transplants, for instance. They'll hold one, then reverse it, and then sometimes even go back to the original position, or their predictions of the end of the world. So you see this with the cadre of the ISO. But once that position has been decided upon as this is what we believe, in our case, they would change their position about whether or not marches were necessary, whether or not a protest should happen or should not happen. And often they would change what that position was. Often it was to the contrary of what most of San Diego's immigrants' rights community and organizations and long-standing veteran activists from decades in the movement believed about what was necessary. But there was this elitism coming from the ISO's leadership that we know best. So once we've decided that, that is God's word, but not God because we don't believe in God. It's Marxist atheism, but it may as well be. So with all the discourse that you would find in the ISO, basically you replace the word God with the revolution or the movement, and it'll be the exact same cultic thinking that you can find in any religious cult on the planet. So that the group's own doctrine set in stone. Now, any questioning of that, any questioning of leadership, any attack on the group, anything perceived as an attack on the group is an attack on the revolution itself. It's an attack on the cause itself. The term red baiting is thrown around a lot. That's a term for prejudice against Marxists, socialists, and leftists, and it's a very real thing. It has been a problem in the history of the United States. Red baiting is real, but for the ISO, red baiting is just the term used for anyone who questions the ISO. So our organization equals the revolution, the movement, the cause. Now, in the same way, they will justify very bad behavior on the ground with the revolution, with the justification that this is necessary to bring about a change in the world. And because our organization is the only one that can do that, no other organization is equipped to do that, any amount of manipulation, of lying, of controlling of other activist groups, ad hominem attacks against other activists, often they devolve into shouting matches. All of that behavior is necessary and justified to bring about this change in the world. So along with that, there comes a heavy amount of denial too. Mental gymnastics are needed to convince ourselves that we are a democratic group, a group that believes in that the only kind of democracy possible, where in fact the internal functionings of the ISO are very authoritarian, to believe that we're supporting other groups, that we are supporting these progressive causes, when the de facto result of this way of interacting with other activist groups, what it means is the ISO becomes parasitic on those groups, taking members from them, and also trying to tell them how to run things. In the case of our San Diego chapter, the highest leadership in the ISO was made up mostly of straight white males. So in the name of progressive politics, you had a small group of straight white males entering other movements of LGBTQ rights, immigrants' rights, and talking to people of color and women and trying to tell them how to do things because we know better. That's the dynamic that you find there. So the result of that is burnout. A group like the ISO churns out scores of ex-activists, people who get so burned out from that exhausting routine of constant attending so many different other meetings, the ISO's own meetings, and attending other activist meetings to find new members and push the ISO's position on them. It's an exhausting routine. I talked to many people who were, while they were still in the ISO and still believed in the ISO, believed it was the organization that was going to change the world, but they were exhausted. And they told me, David, it's like a full-time job here, being in the ISO, all the meetings I have to go to and paper sales, it's like having a second full-time job. And it really is, as is the case with so many cultic groups that just consume all of your time and all of your energy. And you see that in the ISO. Now, the way they treat other Marxist groups, even other groups that hold 99% of their beliefs in common, other groups that are Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist groups, they treat all those groups as apostate, like many cultic groups treat other churches of the same orientation. Other Christian-oriented churches are not Christian at all. They're not saved. So for the ISO, they spend so much time attacking people who share 99% of their beliefs with them. And especially the groups that are most similar, like the Spartacist League, which mention it to any ISO member, you'll hear so many stories about how, oh, those people are so crazy, they don't know what they're talking about. Again, a group that's extremely similar to the ISO. Now, the title of my talk today, Jehovah's Leninists, it's a brilliant bit of wordplay, and I can say that with all humility because I did not come up with it. That title, it was invented by John Lacny, Lacny, and his excellent article I highly recommend. The article is ISO, the Joy of Sects. That's sects. That was in the What Next journal. You can find it online. It's a fantastic article where he goes in depth into his experiences with the ISO as well. So again, an atheist, Marxist-oriented group that nonetheless shows So many cultic dynamics that those of us who've studied the topic are very familiar with from religious cults. So what does that mean? Why is that important? Why is it important to look at? To look at non-religious political cults. Well, first off, it reminds us that disbelief in God is not an inoculation against cultic dynamics. And I say that from personal experience too, that it took me many months to discover this about the ISO, and I did not expect to find any cultic dynamics in a political activist group, because I thought that's what the religious people do. The religious fanatics that I grew up with, they're the ones who behave this way. I did not expect to find cultic behavior in a political group, and many people think the same way. But as M. Scott Peck says in The Road Less Traveled, everyone has a religion. If we define religion as the beliefs that we have about the world and what it means and the way it works, all of us have our own religion of some sort. And if all of us have a religion, well, anyone's religion can be taken into cultic territory. Something else that this teaches us, it teaches us to look out for other types of cultic groups that are not religiously oriented. And another category that's only just barely being examined, not beyond the world of political cults, is cults of coaching and self-help groups that show cultic dynamics. There are many of those groups. I've observed some in the United States and in Mexico. The most notorious is NXIVM, whose leader, Keith Rainier, had women kept as sex slaves for him, had them branded, literally branded their flesh with his own initials, had starved them, taught them to feel terrible if they ever defied him or questioned him. And again, this is a group that does not believe in God, does not have any clear spiritual beliefs at all, but exhibited all the worst types of cultic behavior, all under the guise of being a self-help group, a coaching group that would help people overcome their weaknesses and find success. That's a burgeoning movement of self-help cults out there. So these are things for us to be looking out for. Many of them are appearing. And the irreligious cult, whether it's political or self-help or any other orientation, that may be the new face of cults in our world. I believe religious cults will always exist as well, as long as spirituality and religion exist. But irreligious cults are becoming more and more common. And many of them, like the QAnon movement that I mentioned, exist in cyberspace. They exist online. The author, Steve Hassan, again, the former Moonie who wrote the book, The Cult of Trump, he makes a wonderful observation. He wrote this was in a Vox article. Hassan writes, "We're living in a very different world where the conventional idea of brainwashing is really obsolete. And the idea of a cult as a small group of people sharing physical space is outdated. The internet has changed things. And I think Trump is an example of what a 21st century cult leader looks like." So beyond whatever happens with Trump and the QAnon movement, that dynamic is here to stay. And whether QAnon fizzles out and whether this cult-like movement of fanatics around the leadership of former President Trump, whether that fizzles out and disappears in a few years, the dynamic is still going to be here. It's something for us to look out for. In this age, when so many church meetings and masses are held on Zoom, cyberspace, it's a place where cults are sometimes born as well. Thank you for joining me for this talk. If you'd like to be more in contact, you can check out my website, holyghoststories.com, or email me, holyghoststories@gmail.com. Find me on all the other social media with the same name. I'll be glad to talk more about this. And so now we'll have some time of questions and answers. Thank you.